we have a very tough choice to add anything new apart from we've heard this morning. So I hope we do accomplish that. Fortunately, there are very good expertise among us. Maida's not here. We all miss her. I wish she was here. But we have Agiani, we have Dr. Kaplan, Terrestrial, Carolina. That was great. So let's say a little bit of history. I'll try to make it brief. We do have the time to follow. So first, just out of curiosity, the first dam, there's kind of a little bit of contradiction in data information, but that's what I was able to find. That dates from 2900 before Christ. That was in the Nile, Egypt. The oldest dam that's still active is in where today is Syria and dates back from 1300 before Christ. That's really impressive. Of course, back then we were only talking about dams that were meant for water supply, were meant to be for water supply or irrigation and things like that. But the first hydropower dam was in Wisconsin. That's 1882. And then we finally see the 20th century. That was the century of dams. In 1970, from 1930 to the 70s, actually, we saw a boom of large dams and huge dams. And yes, dams are related to progress and development. Whatever that means, that was how it started. That was a good relation when we heard that on during Vault's presentation. And in 1998, so it was founded the World Commission on Dams. The report is from the year 2000. We still use that. We're anxious to hear about the plus 20 edition. But on the other side, in 1998, it was also the first year that one dam was decommissioned. So we got to see at the same time a start of what's going on with dams and starting to rethink of what, what are the purpose, how, whatever, to decommission them. So we already know what I was talking about. So that was a great picture. I thought I got from the from the damnation. I don't know if you all saw that, but it's a beautiful movement. Yeah, Damnation, the documentary, is very, very interesting. Well, some facts on dams. We can say anything, but there are a few certain facts. All right, they do change the face of the earth. Let me look at here. Well, there's 50,000 of them, so it's impossible. The flooded size is the amount reaches the amount of Spain. So there's no way that something so great, so big will not change the face of the earth. They clog rivers. They change biodiversity. They alter lives. They alter everything around them and people's life. But they do provide important services. 16% of energy of electricity comes from dams. 12 to 15% of irrigation water comes from dams. 80% of the stored, although 15% of, between 12 to 15% goes to irrigation, 80% of the entire storage water goes to hydropower production. But dams also kill fish. They block migration, they deprive water from oxygen, they cause biological disturbance. Again, there are a few controversial data, but what I found is that maybe 20%, let me see here, just a little data on, 20% of the world's freshwater fish have either been extinct, affected, or threatened, by by dams in recent years. So that's a pretty big concern. They change climate. They're a methane pool. They actually respond for 4% of all human-made climate change actions. They also are responsible to flood and to droughts. And they do displace people. We're talking about 80 million people. That's 23 alone in China. That's a lot of people. But we're talking about 500 million if we consider direct and indirect impact. Another facts on dams, they are a risk to lives. Just by being there or originating conflicts or depriving people from human rights, from basic rights. Some cases, well, in Guatemala, once there's 440 indigenous people just killed in a conflict that involved dams. A dam that broke in China killed 200,000 people. That was in 1979. But then again, in Nepal in 2008, there were 250 people killed. So that's easy to say. And yes, they are expensive. Well, they have a 90% cost of overrun. What is the viability of that? Nothing. We can ever think about it unless it's a lawn from my mother, reaches 96% of overcost. And they also have a 44% of average delays. When we're talking about delays, yes, technical mistakes, planning, corruptions, problems, but it's 44% of delay. They don't last forever. They have, oh, I forgot, that represents the threatening life, and that's, how expensive they are. But they do have a time limit. That's why they started to be decommissioned. That's why they need to be revised. They are high maintenance as well. So as I said before, there are 50,000 large dams in the world. There are 350 giant dams under construction. That's a big thing. And $2 trillion was invested on dams. We're talking about $2 trillion. So can we imagine if just part of that amount would be going into finding some alternate source of energy, like Cisney just mentioned, right? Chrisney, yeah. If we had done that before, just destinating just a small amount of that into finding other sources, maybe would be in a different position. That was in the Amazon. Again, I did found different numbers from different sources, and I was confused on where to look. Even government agencies, they all had different figures. So that is the plan. That's not the actual numbers of dams in Brazil, in the Amazon, but the plan, URSA plan, and some other plans, some other people that just think that that's the future. When the plan is completed, by when, we don't know, but the plan is 250 in Brazil, 77 in Peru, 55 in Ecuador, 14 in Bolivia, 6 in Venezuela, 2 in Guyana, 1 in Colombia, French Guyana, and Suriname. So dams in the Amazon, they alter 5 from the total of 6 main rivers that are born in the Andes. In Brazil alone, the first hydropower dam dates back from 1989. That was in Juiz de Fora, in the state of Minas Gerais. 80% of Brazil's energy comes from hydropower generation. So there's 100 dams, about 100 dams in operation, and 137 planned. That's what we're going to see now, just so we're having an idea. That picture probably is going to be somewhere by Michael. But those are the dams in operation, just in Amazon itself. Those were the dams planned. Those were the dam inventoried. And here we have the future scenario. That's basically it.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the ecological impacts of large dams. I'm going to be pretty vague since I can't really take a case study, since there are very situational things that will affect what the ecological impacts are, like how the dam's constructed, where it's constructed, the habitat type, all of that. So this is going to be just a pretty general overview of what could potentially happen around a large dam. So first thing, let's start talking about aquatic systems, since they are the ones that are most obviously impacted, since the dam is built directly into these systems. So Carolina already kind of touched on this, so I'm going to go pretty fast through some of this stuff. But a big impact is the change in water temperature and pH, and that's because the water sits in a reservoir, and then when it's released, it may alter downstream conditions, which can be really bad for wildlife, for aquatic plants, all of that sort of thing. Also, there's a large buildup of sediment behind the dams, so that reduces the nutrient load as the floods are released. And obviously alters the floods, so they may completely erase the seasonality of these rivers and alter the channel shape, which can lead to habitat loss, loss of breeding habitat for fish, all sorts of other impacts. And in general, just loss of up and downstream aquatic biodiversity. So dams tend to favor introduced species, since those are the types of species that really can capitalize on disturbance, and they can outcompete the native species. Also blocks fish migrations, reduces feeding habitat, breeding habitat for all sorts of aquatic animals. Terrestrial systems are also heavily impacted by dams. Obviously, the major impact, or the most prominent impact anyways, is just the loss of habitat during construction and during reservoir inundation. But there's also all of this associated infrastructure development that's going to cause habitat loss. So all these people come in to help build the dam, they have to live somewhere. Also, people who are displaced have to go find somewhere else to live, so they might end up cutting down more trees or clearing more land to live. And also things like roads and power lines and all of the other stuff that they need to make these dams effective. There are also, as Roberta already said, a big source of greenhouse gas emissions from the loss of carbon sequestering habitat, from methane that's produced during as vegetation rots in the reservoirs, and also the reservoirs can store carbon that flows in from the rest of the basin. And floodplain forests are also very heavily impacted. Floodplain forests are really important ecosystems in the Amazon. They're seasonally flooded forests. And they really benefit from the lateral exchange of nutrients. When the rivers come in and flood the area, they lay all the nutrients into the soil. So without those nutrients, it's going to reduce the primary productivity, so we'll have less vegetation in general. And it can also alter tree and plant reproduction, because a lot of these trees require water or fish to disperse their seeds. And that can just lead, all of those things can lead to rare or endemic species loss and any associated wildlife. And these effects are often exacerbated when you have multiple dams on the river, because if the dams are too close together, oxygen content of the water, water temperature, those sorts of things don't have time to equalize between the two dams. And multiple dams for fish to pass. And also, it may just divert water entirely, like the Colorado River no longer reaches the ocean, or just really drastically alter the flows. Okay, believe it or not, there are some positive environmental impacts, though I guess it depends on what you define as positive. So they do create wetlands, which can be really good for waterfowl, can be good for fish, and great opportunities for tourism and recreation, which is obviously a source of income. And it provides a water source for terrestrial wildlife to come in and drink. And there are actually cases where these dams have increased fisheries, mostly in the reservoir and upstream. So this graph over here is taken from the WCD report, and it shows at the Chukuri, I think that's how you say that, dam, which is on the Tocantins River. Before the dam, they did lose species richness around the dam in the first graph, but fisheries in the reservoir and upstream actually did increase. However, depending on what the fishery is, sometimes these fish that are made more common are not the fish that people like to eat. And so there's all sorts of other issues associated with that. But in general, it can increase harvests. In terms of mitigation, there have been very, very few examples of successful mitigation or wildlife rescue from reservoir inundation. Typically, avoidance and minimization techniques are much more effective before the dam is built rather than waiting. We built the dam, made this big mess, how can we clean it up? But of course, avoidance and minimization requires a lot of money. It requires a good information base, so a lot of research and cooperation from all the involved parties, which is easier said than done. Another really great technique is to set aside conservation areas to kind of compensate for whatever habitat loss, and selecting good sites for the dams. Some sites are theoretically less damaging than others, and also whether you put multiple dams on one river or one large dam, some things are going to be slightly less impactful than others. And some example strategies that people have used for mitigation are things like species-specific fish passes. So this down here is a fish ladder. So basically the idea is that the fish can climb up and get over the dam. But they tend to fail a lot because they don't design them for specific species. It's just kind of they throw a ladder out there and hope that the fish can get through. So if they design them with specific fish in mind, they might be more effective. Also things like environmental flow requirements and artificial floods to help maintain the seasonality of the rivers while still generating electricity, though releasing water when at different times is going to reduce the electricity generation, so it's not necessarily a very popular strategy. And also decommissioning dams obviously is a good thing for the environment, but again, not a very common thing, especially in the Amazon. So I just want to quickly emphasize before I turn over to May to talk about social issues, what these effects of the environmental changes are on people. So these dams are going to reduce the quality and quantity of fisheries in a lot of cases, limit traditional floodplain agricultural activities because of the reduced primary productivity, can lead to loss of wildlife, so reduced hunting opportunities, loss of income from timber and other extractive products, as well as increases in transmission. So typically around dams, you see more malaria, you see more parasites, also harmful algal blooms in the reservoirs, which can be toxic to people, and the mercury that's produced during mining often accumulates in the reservoirs, so that can be really bad as well. Potentially that, as well as people just being brought into the proximity of malaria. People who are coming from, coastal cities may not be as much exposed as when they get out in the middle of the Amazon. And there's a lot of other, there's a lot of research being done on that. In some cases, I've seen a couple of papers that talk about how being along the edges of the forest is going to increase malaria versus deforestation plays a role in that as well.
It's too bright out there.
Any other questions?
Okay, I'll talk a little bit about the social impacts of dams, and I think we've had a lot of really good on-the-ground information already on what's happening from Bengal and Carolina, and even Myra talking last week about the social movements, because it makes it really clear, like, people are fighting for their lives. And so I'm focusing a little bit on what this World Commission on Dams said, and they did this report in 2001. So I kind of want to talk a little bit more, so we know a lot already what's going on the ground, what the official perception is.
of these issues. And when you read this report from 2001, they talk about the potential direct and indirect benefits that we also talked about a little bit, that there is increased availability of electricity, although oftentimes it goes to generating products that will be exported, but cheaper electricity for some people, economic growth, some job creation during construction, and this is what I would call like the good news bears. So, and these good news are affecting a fairly large number of people, hopefully, like where we saw like all these coastal cities having cheaper, more reliable electricity. There's some benefits there, and the statistics vary, but maybe 80% of the electricity in Brazil comes from hydroelectric dams. I think Davis was 7%, a pretty big chunk. But as we also know, and as the WCD recognizes, there's a really big bad news bear. And that's like the displacement, that's both physical and the livelihood displacement of people. This planning blight, which is once there is a plan to put a dam in an area, often like all investment in infrastructure in that area ceases. There is inadequate compensation for the people who suffer or who will have to suffer the consequences. Often there's official coercion and no representation. And we know that there are good laws, or that there are some laws in place to involve people, but we also know that oftentimes this is kind of like after the fact they try to involve people and they've kind of already made the decision to put the dam there, which for me that's the biggest take-home messages of all of this. So anyways, I might be repeating myself on that point because me. And the absence of livelihood opportunities at the resettlement sites. We've observed a lot. And yeah, like 14 years ago, the official not governing board, but this official organization like recognized all these things. So just in Brazil, an estimated 1 million people are affected directly, and I think that's probably a pretty gross underestimation after all we've heard here today. Like so many hundreds of thousands of families displaced, 70% have not received compensation, and again, those might actually be underestimates. And all of this, although there are laws in place, even when it comes to mitigation that people should be compensated, there seems to be a complete lack of enforcement of those rules. And apparently there's this construct of the threat to national security that's like an artifact from the military dictatorship that they just use to override a lot of the concerns that are happening. So what they do when they kind of after they decide that they want the dam, they do a cost-benefit analysis to kind of like say like, well, but we have the good news here, and like how do we compare, like, maybe just a few people who have to suffer, like maybe that weighs out like the benefit to the many, right? So they use this construct of the balance sheet approach. And but the truth is, and the WCD says this, like it just doesn't work, because what's happening when you build a dam is that it's not that you're harnessing a resource that was previously unused. That was a used resource. People are making their livelihoods there. Like people are getting the fish, and yeah, so the resource is being used. And when you build the dam, the resource is transferred from these people to these other people. And again, as we talked about, kind of the resource gets transported sometimes into the pocketbooks of very few. And the WCD says that this is actually really not acceptable anymore. So 14 years ago, they said, like, well, you can't do this balance sheet approach. Even if you do it correctly, it's not really acceptable. And so when they talk about mitigation, I added this first part that really ideally you would do a thorough alternatives approach first and make sure that is the hydroelectric dam really the best option to generate the electricity or whatever the resources that you need. But some dams will be built, and so based on that assumption, the WCD says that there are mitigation strategies like give legal rights to the people who are being resettled. say like resettling people as communities so that some of the social structures can be maintained, like helps negotiate compensation packages and make sure that there are actually available livelihood strategies available in the resettlement areas. So they suggest these things, but they totally recognize 14 years ago that indigenous people are disproportionately affected. The downstream livelihoods are often severely impacted, but not accounted for at all. There is undercounting of the affected people. Like they say, like, yeah, you 100 people over here, you'll get compensation, but the like maybe 800 people who are a little bit further away, who are just as impacted, don't get anything. Women bear a disproportionate burden in proportion of the effects. Cultural heritage, like we talk about species lost, but there's also like livelihood strategies lost and cultural things that, anyways, that are lost. And JC talked about the impacts on human health. So they recognize all of this. It's well known. And they say that, again, if a dam really is needed, you can have approaches for a more equitable distribution of the costs and benefits with a benefit sharing approach where you try to like move the profits maybe from the pocketbooks of like 5 people to like at least like give like some to the affected people. By giving land rights to displaced people and improving livelihoods, they talk about some cases where where dams had positive effect for people who previously didn't even have rights to the land where they were. When they got resettled, they gave them land rights, so there were like some improvements for people. So sometimes you can do something like that. There are different forms of like benefit sharing programs, reparations. But like 14 years ago, we already knew like there is still a total lack of commitment to a more equitable distribution of the benefits. So like we know all this, like on the mainstream level, that we know. So
can I make one comment?
yeah.
Now they have to they sign some conditions. They then sign some. They have to divide the benefits or compensate the people. But what is called fishermen? They don't know how to work the money. And some I interviewed few women where they said our folks get the money, they feel that they are rich, and they let they goes away.
Yeah.
If they are very rich now, they buy a lot of alcohol, a new car, other house, and leave the woman and the kids. Yeah. Terrible. But they normally the company said, "Oh, but I give them the money." But neither the government or the dam didn't see the dam try to organize what they can do with the money. Because we asked the dam, but you should help them. No, it's their money. They should know what to do with it.
Marina, I'm so glad you're bringing this up because I remember we had a conversation about this before, and I think that is a really important point with these alternative approaches. Like there was like something like 10%, like a pretty big chunk of the profit is dedicated to this profit sharing. But on the one hand, yes, sometimes the money just gets drunk away, and then you also talked about like they are building a school, but really they are, there's so much money there and it costs 10 times as much as it should because of corruption, and again it flows into the pockets of some people. Anyway, I'm sorry, it's really depressing and hopefully we can make it better.
Okay, so lastly, I'm going to talk about scale and socio-environmental perspectives in dam research. So I was really interested to hear David and Jernival talk about how hydropower projects are something that is becoming or has become more of a worldwide phenomenon. And in terms of research, I would encourage anyone who's interested to look at some of these other case studies in sort of understanding social movement organization. There's a lot of research that's been done in India, and interestingly, the Three Gorges Dam in China now is the largest, I believe. But a lot of people have pointed that example of where the importance of the political environment for which the dams are taking place, where there isn't a lot of access for voices. And a lot of the research that was done on the Three Gorges Dam happened to really reinforce the sort of government plan, which is interesting. But basically, yeah, since the Rio 92 and other meetings, hydropower has really come out as the clean alternative to nuclear and fossil fuel energy production. And like I said, this has really taken off in China, India, and Brazil, as well as Southeast Asia and parts of Africa as well. And a major part that we often overlook is that the energy production is also a component, but waterway transportation is also a really large emphasis. And as we saw in America, I mean, we dammed the Snake River up in Montana, Wyoming area, and it was pretty much not for no energy production, but really to create the canals and the locks. And you also have to dredge the river, and it gets rid of rapids and things like that. So, water on them. But we also have, of course, as Roberta brought up, we have these regional issues in terms of, the IRSA project. And I think it really is important when we think of dams in the Amazon to remember that it is going to be a component of this larger infrastructural integration project, which we're going to see large-scale socio-ecological transformation. So a part that I guess I'm particularly interested in, so I happen to do this, and I noticed that something that didn't really come up that much in terms of talking about it, is this idea of predicting and remodeling reservoirs and influences on land use and land cover change. And so we see these more direct land uses and land cover changes that result as a result of reservoir creation and inundation. So basically that's where we go from converting forests or agriculture, urban land uses and covers directly to water. And really the major issue with this is obviously, as a result of Balbina up around Manaus and Tucuruí, these companies are supposed to be deforesting their reservoir areas before they go in, but whether or not that's really happening, no one's sure. And there's still going to be organic matter, obviously, in the bottom of the reservoir, which is going to create an anoxic aquatic environment and the creation of methyl mercury, which is going to get into the fish. And then to continue, we also see these indirect land uses and land cover changes, which is sort of more the economic function that comes along with it. So on the one hand, we have displacement, where obviously these people are going to have to be resettled, but in a lot of cases, we've seen that we would expect the number of cropland or ranching land to dwindle as a result of reservoir creation, but in a lot of instances, we see that that number actually stays the same. So we can only assume that those people are now moving into forested areas. And in terms of some of these resettlement packages that have come along, they're not economically, socioculturally compatible with what they're used to. So given the chance of taking the money or taking the resettlement plan in a planned community, most people are going to take the money and potentially deforest or move somewhere else in the forest. And I sort of briefly mentioned the effects of dams on water cycles. As covered in one of the papers we read. Obviously, they're sort of prolonging this long-term consequence about losing water in the Amazon region. And then we also see upstream losses and downstream losses in land cover and land type. This is actually not from the Amazon, but I thought it was a really great example. They did a pretty good job. It's actually in Argentina, which is pretty close. But as you can see, the amount lost in both upstream and downstream, obviously upstream where the reservoir is being created, you're going to expect to see more land cover and land use change, but downstream we also see a loss in these ecosystems as well as things like crops and bare soil. And this is actually based off of something that's also not in the Amazon, but there's a really great book by William Loker, who's a geographer, anthropologist, and he did his dissertation research in the El Cajon region of rural Honduras. And basically what he did is he went back and revisited his site after they built a dam, and what he noticed was that there were these changes in the physical sort of ecological systems, like the reservoir, land cover, aquatic systems, all those things, but that these changes in the physical landscape also led to changes in the social landscape. And basically these socio-ecological systems, these connections, as Carlito was talking about, between different economic factors, between different cultural factors, had all been had all been changed. And I think this has a really profound impact on in terms of rural territorial development, because one thing that he noticed was that when you create a reservoir, as Zernabal talked about it, that energy is not necessarily going for lights in everybody's houses. It's often going for industrialization. So what Locher found was that not only did they take resources in that form of land and water and fisheries and things like that, but also became this rural exodus, people leaving those more rural type of jobs to go to the larger city where there was a factory and begin working. So in a sense, it was taking the labor. And sort of last thing I'm interested in is perspectives on resistance to hydropower. There have been a number of interesting papers about IRSA and development in the Amazon region. Is this sort of neo-developmentalism, or should we sort of think about this in terms of putting it in part and parcel with the development that came in the 1960s and 1970s? Dr. Walker came out with a paper where he talks about this as a part of sort of a cultural hegemony or a historical block about utilizing Brazilian resources for Brazilian economic growth and the sort of discourse of Brazilian political and economic elites. And there's a woman, Eve Bratman, who I talked about last week, who has a really interesting sort of Gramscian perspective on this idea of passive revolution in the green economy, where the environment is actually becoming this divisive tool for political economic elites to create divisions among voters, people who are upset. And also we have this complexity and resistance and displacement. We saw Anthony Oliver Smith has done a lot of really great work, but we sort of still have to keep this in terms of understanding this in the context of the greater development schemes. Some post-development perspectives, is thinking about alternatives to development and sustainable development. But there are also people who come out and say maybe we should forget the post-development sort of more abstract theoretical, and really this comes down to people want a more active participation in choosing where these development projects are going to take place and how they're going to be impacted. That there's a lack of connection between stakeholders and planners. And lastly, there's sort of this issue of scale and resistance where people are now beginning to sort of question the role of, as we've done in this class, of NGOs and transnational activist networks in resistance to local dam projects. International Rivers, who I think that they're a really great organization and they've done a lot of great work. That's where our maps came from. Today they organized that GIS for us. People are wondering how much of this should now be a Brazilian issue. What is the role of outside activists and outside environmentalists coming in? And we sort of do what they've historically done, things with Sting, Sigourney Weaver, things like that, and brought in and come next to the indigenous groups and things like that. And people see that and they think, well, that's not development. That's not the economic growth that we want. And as you brought up, it's very hard to create these intersections of difference between fishermen, indigenous groups, rural syndicate workers, things like that. It's been a different kind of struggle, and it's very place-based depending on who you have indigenous groups. And it's interesting because Belo Monte, I think, is by far the most researched. And most people have done work on that, and it is from an indigenous. It does cover it, but it also brings to light, the importance of those lotes and sentimentos that are in that region that were affected as well. And lastly, to bring up the sort of how this has become a very contentious topic in Brazil, they did this energy study, which I thought was really interesting. Yes, the framing of the question is a little bit off. How, even though they're going to create, however, they will cause damage to animals that live in the rivers. Should Brazil invest in more hydroelectric power plants?
That's how they phrase the question.
Yeah. Further survey, which has not been good, right? Obviously, and they did this for other potential energy generation. And we'll say that most people were in support of wind and solar power. But I thought it was interesting for this one because it was by far the most divisive. I think overall you find 2/5 of the people that were surveyed were either totally agreed or not agreed, and then you see here that people who at least partially agreed. I mean, I know that it's difficult because given the choice of totally agreeing or partially agreeing, I think most people are probably inclined to partially agree. But I think across the board, you see that in general, most people are actually in support of the project. I mean, granted, like I said, the phrasing of the question, if the phrasing of the question had been that it's going to damage socio-ecological, socio-cultural, and socio-economic, structures in the Amazon region, they might have changed their answer a little bit. But obviously, there is some form of environmentalism that's still taking place that people know about this issue. But on the other hand, people, particularly in the North, which I was surprised about, that there's about 39% people that at least partially agreed with that. So yeah, I was going to sort of lead that into the discussion. We sort of talked about it before about what the role of sort of this global citizen perspective on everything is now, that these countries that maybe back in the days of Wallerstein and other people, we would have sort of called them peripheral countries, but now they have their own NGOs. Now they have their own development organizations, and they have their own development plans, and they have funding for them. So what does this mean for the future? I guess that's a little bit of a broad question. That's the end of it.